Okay, and we are back with what should be our final section of our discussion of the endocrine system, and we're going to take a look next at the parathyroid glands, of which there are actually four of them that sit right adjacent to and actually attach themselves to the thyroid gland. And so these glands are going to release a hormone called PTH, which is parathyroid hormone, which has the antagonistic effect of calcitonin. So whereas calcitonin is going to help decrease blood calcium levels, PTH is going to help increase blood calcium levels. It's another case of antagonism where when one hormone has one mode of activity, the other one has the opposite mode of activity. Okay, so in this case, when it comes time to raise blood calcium levels, the way that this happens is that there are cells, bone cells, which we haven't looked at yet. We haven't gotten to that chapter quite yet. But certain bone cells called osteoclasts, which are going to help break down calcium phosphate. Calcium phosphate is the matrix in which bone cells are embedded. So they're going to break down calcium phosphate crystals and release calcium ions into the blood. And so you might think that, okay, well, geez, breaking down bone, that doesn't sound like the best thing to do. I don't want my bones to get thinner or less massive. I want them to be as strong as possible. Well, there are times when, if blood calcium levels fall in particular, you're much better off to dissolve a little bit of bone calcium, get that into the blood to help your body function normally than to do nothing at all. Another effect of this is that your kidneys are going to reabsorb more calcium ions. So the kidneys are the filtration unit of the body. They can reabsorb ions at will from the blood. If you have excess calcium ions in the blood, some calcium can be filtered out, could actually leave the body with the urine. In this case, though, if blood calcium is too low, you don't want to lose any blood calcium. So any that's passing through the kidneys can be reabsorbed once PTH has been released by the parathyroid glands. The other aspect of this is that vitamin D can be activated. Parathyroid hormone actually has an effect on an enzyme to help activate vitamin D, which of course is also a very critical substance for our bodies to take in. The final effect of PTH is to allow the intestines to absorb more calcium ions. So even in the intestines, there are varying levels of absorbability of calcium. At times they might not absorb very much. At other times they might absorb a lot. So with PTH being released, intestinal absorption of calcium ions is going to be at a maximum because, of course, again, we're assuming blood calcium levels are too low. So again, we have our parathyroid glands, these four little dots here that are embedded into the thyroid gland itself. If blood calcium is too low, these glands can then release PTH, which has three effects on calcium ions at least. The fourth effect that we talked about was on vitamin D, so not a direct relationship here. PTH is going to cause increased absorption from the intestines, increased reabsorption from the kidneys, and increased osteoclast activity, resulting in released calcium into the blood with the osteoclasts. So three different effects there, all of them leading to increased levels of blood calcium. The medulla, now we're going to take a look at the adrenal glands in particular, starting off with the medulla aspects of the adrenal glands itself. The medulla is the part that's kind of in the center. The core part of the adrenal glands is called the medulla of the adrenal gland. The outer part on the outside, this outer layer here, is called the adrenal cortex. So the medulla is involved in secreting epinephrine and norepinephrine, which, as we have seen, are part of that autonomic parasympathetic reflex in response to acute stress. They're going to help do all the things we talked about before with dilating blood vessels and increasing respiration and cardiac output and decreasing digestion, those sorts of things in response to stress. So the adrenal medulla can release those two substances in response to stress. Again, there's a negative feedback going on here. So we talked about before, much earlier in the chapter, ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone. So one of the things you might want to ask yourself is, where does ACTH come from? Well, adrenocorticotropic hormone is one of those tropic hormones, as the name would imply, that comes from the adenohypophysis, or the anterior pituitary, which can then stimulate the adrenal gland to produce not only these hormones down here, but also epinephrine and norepinephrine in response to stress. The cortex, then, is the part that's more under control of the ACTH, and the cortex is what's involved with releasing corticosteroids and glucocorticoids like cortisol. What this is going to do, this is in more of in the context of long-term or chronic stress. So not the kind of stress that you're confronted by a mugger on the street or you're about to get in a car accident. This is the kind of stress that you're at a crummy job for the past 10 years and you're stressed out all the time. These are the substances that are going to come in this context in response to that stress. The long-term effect of this is, among other things, a suppressed immune system, which of course is not a good thing. So as you probably know, the more stressed you are, the more likely you are to get sick from time to time because your immune system is not functioning maybe as it should. The adrenal cortex is also involved in releasing aldosterone, which is, when you want to look at the most important hormones in the body, aldosterone is right up there. Aldosterone kind of has a similar complementary effect to ADH. Aldosterone is going to help conserve water by conserving sodium ions. So when blood sodium levels are too low, and sodium ions are, again, one of those very critical substances that our bodies need to have for function of everything from the nervous system to various other aspects of our physiology, aldosterone can be released, which is going to cause much less sodium to be released from both the kidneys in the form of urine as well as sweat glands. So you're going to conserve salt, conserve sodium, and in response to that, water levels are going to be retained as well. So water always tends to follow the ions, and if we're maintaining more sodium, then we're also going to maintain more water. So it's a twofold effect. Number one is conserving sodium, and then the second effect of that also is to help conserve water. So like I said, it's a complementary effect to ADH and sort of an antagonistic effect to atrial natriuretic peptide that we're going to see here in a few minutes as well. Now the pancreas is also very much a part of the endocrine system, although it does have both endocrine and exocrine function. The exocrine part comes in the form of digestive enzymes that are secreted during that process. The endocrine function of the pancreas is also very important. And so the pancreas is connected to the small intestine, specifically at the duodenum, which is the kind of the first part of the small intestine once you leave the stomach. And that's where we're going to see secretion of some of the digestive enzymes. When it comes time for the endocrine function of the pancreas, we can look at groups of cells that are called the islets of Langerhans, which is one of my favorite terms in biology, islets of Langerhans. They remind some of islands embedded within this overall greater mass of tissue that is the pancreas. There are these groups of cells that are responsible for producing and releasing both insulin and glucagon. So we've seen this before. This is kind of one of our case study examples of how negative feedback works in the body. They're going to be involved in raising and lowering blood glucose as needed. So the beta cells of the pancreas involved with the islets of Langerhans are the ones that are going to secrete insulin if things are working properly. So after a meal when blood glucose is high, beta cells kick into action and they're going to help release insulin. Insulin therefore is going to cause blood glucose levels to go back down. And once blood glucose levels start to drop, that's going to feed back and help shut down the production of further insulin. There's no point in making more insulin than you really need to. On the other hand, once blood glucose levels fall after a meal, between meals, now the alpha cells of the pancreas, the alpha cells of the islets of Langerhans, are going to secrete glucagon, which is going to cause this stored up glucose, stored up in the form of glycogen or fat, this glucose to be re-released again back into the blood and allow blood glucose levels to go back up again. So once blood glucose climbs, again, we get a negative feedback back up here. Increased levels of blood glucose are going to cause decreased levels of glucagon, which helps to level us off at the point where we need to be for blood glucose. So these two hormones in combination are going to help us maintain glucose homeostasis in the blood. Now what about diabetes? All right, diabetes comes in two forms. You hear about type 1 and type 2 diabetes. One of them is genetic, one of them is more environmentally influenced. Type 1 diabetes is the genetic form. This is a situation where the beta cells of the pancreas do not secrete insulin like they're supposed to. And of course, what you want to think about is why that might be. Why wouldn't the beta cells produce insulin? Well, first off, what is insulin? It's a protein, right? It's a protein hormone. And like any other protein, the instructions for making insulin are written into the genetic code. So if an individual inherits a faulty copy of the insulin gene, if they don't know how to make insulin genetically, then they're not going to make insulin. All right, well, that's bad enough, but what does that mean for you? Well, it means that if you're going to survive, if you're going to live a relatively normal life, you're going to have to inject insulin because your body is not making any. So if your blood glucose is high, if it doesn't come back down to where it needs to be, that can actually cause tissue damage throughout the body. All kinds of side effects of diabetes if it's not controlled. So here we're talking about injecting insulin because the body itself isn't making any. Type 2 diabetes is non-insulin dependent, and this is where most people kind of fall in. This is a situation where an individual has an excess of blood glucose in their diet, or the excess of glucose in their diet. Blood glucose is high too long, too often, too many days, whatever. And so receptor cells, liver cells, skeletal muscle cells, those kinds of things, they start producing fewer receptors. They're getting so much insulin so much of the time, their response is to start making fewer receptors because logically there's so much insulin around, why have so many receptors? You can use those resources elsewhere, use those proteins to do something else. All right, well that's all well and good, but what that means then is that if you're producing insulin, and these people, type 2 diabetic patients, do produce insulin. They have the perfectly normal gene for insulin. They make all the insulin in the world, but they don't have enough receptors on the cells. And if you don't have enough receptors on the cells, then it doesn't matter how much insulin you throw at them, they're not going to get the signal. They're not going to reduce blood glucose like they're supposed to, and you start running into some of the same side effects of diabetes that we talked about with type 1. Type 2 diabetes, insulin injections will do no good because you're making insulin anyway. Right? Adding more insulin isn't going to fix the problem. You don't have enough receptors. So in the case of type 2 diabetes, the corrective action or the therapeutic action would be to moderate with proper diet and also proper levels of exercise. So you don't want to consume excess levels of glucose, and you also want to exercise because exercise will also bring down glucose when it's in the blood. So between controlling it dietarily as well as with physical activity, that's a pretty good way to help control type 2 diabetes. All right, the next hormones we're going to look at are produced by the gonads. So here we're talking about the ovaries and testes in females versus males respectively. These are both sex steroids. In females, we talk about estrogen and progesterone. Both of these are involved, and we'll talk about them a lot more when we talk about animal reproduction as far as what they do. But they're involved with producing the secondary sex characteristics in females, as well as ovulation, and reproductive behavior in general. Gestation, nourishing the growing embryo and fetus is also very much at play when we start talking about estrogen and progesterone. The androgens are things like testosterone, and so again, they're going to result in kind of the primary, secondary male sex characteristics as well as the ability to produce sperm cells. So in this case, we're talking about testosterone, some of its other derivatives that result in the typical male characteristics that we think about. So with estrogen, this one is involved primarily with stimulating egg cell maturation, as well as the secondary sexual characteristics that we talk about. So enlarged breasts and so forth as females reach reproductive age. Whereas progesterone is involved more with allowing the reproductive tract to get to the point where it could actually receive a fertilized egg and allow it to develop fully. So maintaining the endometrial lining of the uterus, to allow implantation of a zygote, if a zygote is formed, is the primary role of progesterone in the female reproductive system. And both of these, by the way, too, we talked previously, much longer ago in this chapter, about GnRH and LH and FSH. So you want to go back and think about the gonadotropin-releasing hormone, luteinizing hormone, and follicle-stimulating hormone, and the effects they have on both estrogen and testosterone, as well as the effects that estrogen and progesterone have on GnRH, LH, and FSH. Right? It's part of that negative feedback cycle we talked about. Testosterone is the most important of the steroid androgens. Sperm cell production does not happen without normal levels of testosterone. So if it's too high or if it's too low, sperm cells cannot be produced successfully, at least in the numbers that they should be produced. It's also involved with male secondary sexual characteristics. So as males approach puberty, broadening shoulders, increased muscle mass, increased body hair, deepening of voice, Adam's apple, all that kind of stuff results from increased testosterone production as the males approach puberty. The pineal gland is produced by, again, part of the brain here, and this one's involved with melatonin. Melatonin, we now know, is at least somewhat in play when we start thinking about how sleep is regulated in the body. Melanin is involved with melanin granules. And so the overall idea with melatonin, what we think happens here is that as you're awake during the day, melatonin levels and melanin granule levels are increasing throughout the day. And once they increase above a certain threshold, you start to become sleepy. Right? The reason why you start to feel like you're sleepy at night is because you've been awake long enough that the levels of this hormone are high enough that it's starting to make you feel like you need to go to sleep. So it's a really kind of nice built-in automatic way to help synchronize your body with what we call a circadian rhythm. More or less a 24-hour cycle of light and dark is maintained in part, at least, by melatonin. And you can find all kinds of melatonin supplements to help people sleep better and those sorts of things. The results of these, or the efficacy of these things, is maybe mixed at best, but we do know it is at least somewhat involved with sleep. Some of the other hormones, I mentioned a few minutes ago, atrial natriuretic peptide, or just atrial natriuretic hormone. This is secreted by the heart, and it is secreted in response to increased blood volume. So if you have an increase in blood volume, that's going to lead to an increase in blood pressure, just like a decreased blood volume leads to decreased blood pressure. If blood pressure is increased, the right atrium of the heart is going to detect that because there are baroreceptors in that portion of the heart. That's going to allow the body to produce a higher volume of urine. So the primary effect, one of the primary effects of ANH is to tell the kidneys that they need to reabsorb less water and put more water into the filtrate, which is eventually what becomes urine. So you pee more is the take-home message, right? So with greater urine output comes lower blood volume, also lower levels of salt in the blood because that kind of goes along with the water. And it allows you to maintain a correct blood volume. So atrial natriuretic peptide is the antagonist to both ADH and aldosterone. It does pretty much the opposite of both of those two hormones. The thymus gland is involved. It produces a hormone called thymosin, which is a hormone involved in the maturation of T cells, which are part of your acquired immunity in your body. The thymus gland is kind of unique in the fact that it actually gets smaller as you age. So when you're very, very young, your thymus gland is very active because you're building up immunity to all kinds of new pathogens that you've never seen before. As you get older, the thymus gland gets less and less active. And as you probably well know, as people age, especially as they reach their elderly senior citizen years, they tend to get sick more. More colds, more flus, more pneumonias, those kinds of things. Infections are much more common in part, not completely as a result of, but in part because the thymus gland is less active and you're producing fewer T cells than you did when you were a kid. And so it tends to function less as we age. Renin is a hormone that's involved with, there's a lot going on here with renin. Renin's involved with catalyzing a production of a hormone called angiotensin, which is going to cause vasoconstriction and also increases in blood pressure. So if blood pressure drops as a result of an injury or dehydration sort of a thing, renin is going to cause the release of angiotensin, which helps to constrict blood vessels and raise blood pressure to the point where you don't pass out. Think about what happens if blood pressure drops. One of the things that's going to happen is that you're going to get dizzy and you may well pass out if blood volume is too low. Renin is going to help prevent that. Right? It's involved with making sure that blood pressure is high enough that you remain conscious and alert even when you may be injured. Maybe you've suffered a blood loss, maybe you're severely dehydrated. Renin and angiotensin are going to help make sure you maintain consciousness in those conditions. Erythropoietin is involved. It's produced by the kidney in response to the brain detecting that it has abnormally low levels of oxygen over a long period of time. Erythropoietin is going to stimulate the bone marrow to start producing more erythrocytes. Erythrocytes are red blood cells. They're the ones that carry oxygen. So if the body is running low on oxygen for a prolonged period of time, one of the ways it can accommodate that or correct that action is by producing more red blood cells. Erythropoietin from the kidneys tells the bone marrow to make more red blood cells, which carry more oxygen, which make the brain happier. Okay, so it's a way to help increase levels of oxygen being carried in the blood. There are a variety of other digestive hormones. We'll talk about these, not a ton right now, but gastrin, secretin, and CCK or cholecystokinin are three digestive hormones that are involved either in gastric motility and digestion or appetite control to a degree. Adipose tissue or fat cells can also produce a substance called leptin, which is a relatively recent discovery noted for its ability to control appetite. So when someone is satiated, when they've had enough to eat, what typically happens is that their adipose cells are going to release leptin, which is going to tell the brain that food intake can go ahead and slow down or even stop. So in other words, leptin is the stuff, in part, that makes you feel like you're full and that you don't want to eat anymore. So right off the bat, when that was first discovered, people thought, okay, well, cool, this could be a really neat appetite suppressant. We could just take more leptin to make ourselves feel full all the time so that we don't eat as much, and that way we're going to lose weight, right? Seems like a fairly logical conclusion to make, but the problem with that is that even though this works really well in mice, right? The mouse on the left in this picture, this poor guy over here, this mouse has had his gene for leptin blocked. Leptin, again, is a protein-based hormone, so there is a gene for leptin in the genome of not only mice but humans. If you block that gene so that leptin is no longer produced in the body, then all of a sudden this mouse has no signal. This mouse has no signal to tell itself that it's full. So the mouse doesn't ever really feel like it's full. It continues to eat and eat and eat and eat, and before long it becomes relatively large, I guess we could say. The mouse on the right has a normal gene for leptin, so once it's had enough to eat, it goes about other activities, building nests and reproducing and taking care of offspring and those sorts of things, whereas the mouse on the left only wants to eat all the time. The other issue with this is that humans eat for a lot of reasons. Like, I probably don't have to tell you this, but humans eat for, in fact, I would even argue least often for hunger. I would say that people eat for any other reason aside from hunger first. People eat based on what time the clock says, whether or not they're hungry. People eat for comfort, people eat for socializing, people eat for pleasure, people eat because they like the way food tastes. Maybe sometimes they're hungry, but more often than not, they're eating for other reasons. So even though leptin or adding leptin might make you feel full, I suspect that wouldn't really prevent people from eating as much as what they normally would. I think probably people would still eat the same amount, even though they might feel fuller more of the time. So we'll see these again when we cover our chapter on digestive system. They're going to pop up again, but just kind of a quick intro because they are hormones, and for that reason they fall into this chapter as well. All right, so that's the end of our chapter on the endocrine system. So we're going to wrap this up, and I will get these posted.